and examine some of the key issues that have confronted and continue to confront editors and reporters in American newsrooms. First, though, a couple of administrative notes. For those of you not familiar with how this virtual format works, you'll still be able to ask a question of the author if you'd like. To do so, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. The chat function there also will be active, and in that column, you'll find a link for purchasing copies of this evening's featured book, All About the Story by Leonard Downie, Jr., and today is the release date. Len's a newspaper man through and through, and his new book is a look back at his extraordinary career at the Washington Post, a career that spanned 44 years and involved him in coverage of some of the most seismic events of those times, from Watergate to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. As the paper's top editor in the 1990s and much of the 2000s, he also presided over a period of painful, uncertain transition as the digital age dawned and the Post, along with many other media companies, struggled to adjust. Len started at the Post as what he calls an accidental intern in 1964 at the age of 22. And within a short time, he became an investigative reporter, earning already at age 24 recognition as a Pulitzer Prize finalist for coverage that transformed Washington's local court system. In his early 30s, he worked on the Watergate story as an editor, then ran the paper's large local news staff for a few years, after which he went abroad to serve as a foreign correspondent in London. He returned in 1982 to head the national desk, and 2 years later, at age 42, was promoted to managing editor. In 2001, he succeeded Ben Bradlee as executive editor of the Post, a position he held for 17 years until 2008. Len was known as a hands-on activist editor. He never lost his early zest for high-impact investigative stories or his enthusiasm for hard news and breaking stories. But he also was infamous for a consuming preoccupation with weather stories. Above all, he was regarded in the Post newsroom as eminently fair-minded, scrupulously objective, and deeply committed to the paper. After leaving the Post, Len became a professor, teaching investigative reporting at Arizona State University and dividing his time between Phoenix and Washington. He also wrote a novel, The Rules of the Game, about a Washington investigative reporter and a US president, both of them women. And he co-wrote The News Media, about the challenges facing media organizations today. These books joined a list of 4 previous works he had written while at the Post. I got to know Len during the 30 years I worked there at the paper. So it's a treat to be able to moderate this evening's discussion with him and look back on some of that period. Welcome, Len, and congratulations on the new book.
Thank you very much. I like to think my preoccupation with weather made me an early climate change person.
Well, if you'd like to think that, you may. You definitely were on top of that story. Of course, the book has a lot of fascinating behind-the-scenes material in it that illuminates how the Post pursued some major stories, and we'll get to some of them in a minute. And it also reflects on the transition that's still happening at the Post and other newspapers from what was a golden age of print journalism to the digital age. But let me start by asking why write a memoir at this point? I mean, you note at the outset of the book that you hadn't written much about yourself before.
Yes, as I say in the book, I was raised by Midwestern parents who taught me to be to not toot my own horn, and as executive editor of the paper, I wanted to make sure that all the people who were smarter and more talented than I were got the spotlight rather than me. But when it came time to leave the Post, and I had to deal with all the files of all the things that I had done there and were done at the paper while I was there, I realized there probably was a story here. I still was reluctant for quite some time until I talked to Bob Woodward about it, of all people, who writes books every 2 minutes. And he said I had a story to tell. I was present for so much history. I was involved in so much history as a reporter and especially as an editor that I really owed it to the public to tell those stories. And that's the purpose of the book. Not so much to be about me, except my story is kind of interesting in that I came from a state university in Ohio and to a newspaper that was then filled with Ivy League graduates. And rose from an accidental intern to executive editor. So that's in the background all the time. But what's in the foreground is how newspapers work. I wanted to take this particular time when there's so much untruths about the news media, so many attacks on the news media, to show how we really work. And not at Fox News, but at a newspaper like the Washington Post, a news organization like the Washington Post. It's now has much larger internet audience than a print audience, but to show how the stories are really put together, how we are interested in news and not interested in partisanship, and to go through that piece by piece with some of the many stories that I worked on.
Yeah, and that for sure is what makes the story of your own career so relevant to today. Is that many of the tough journalistic decisions that you faced are ones that continue to confront reporters and editors today. Questions like what should be reported about the private lives of politicians and other public figures. How can a newspaper editor decide what stories would or wouldn't endanger human life or national security? And we'll get to your thoughts on those and other questions in a minute. But I want to ask you about investigative journalism, right, because that's a term that's thrown around a lot. You spent your early years at the Post as an investigative reporter, and you continue to teach about that subject today. One could argue that much journalism is investigative in nature. So what exactly does being an investigative journalist mean?
It means digging deeper than in news stories that are events or press conferences or things that are on the surface. Digging below the surface to discover things that are not working properly and may need change by society. That can be anything from obviously from government and politics to corporations and charities, all those kinds of things were sports organizations, et cetera. All those things were investigated at one time or another by Post journalists when I was running the newspaper.
Speak louder.
Is that Janice in the back there?
Janice in the background.
Coaching you there.
Yes, exactly.
She want to say hi to everybody?
She's gone.
Yeah. So after you being an investigative reporter, you became an editor at a pretty young age. But as you note in the book, you didn't have any formal training in managing a newsroom, and that's very typical of the way reporters get tapped to serve as editors. It was then and continues to be today. Newsrooms historically have been poor at putting time and effort into systematically developing editors. Talk about why that is and the consequences of it, and whether something should be done to better prepare journalists to be editors.
There have been attempts to do that. Some of the big newspaper chains over the decades tried to do that. I don't know how successful it was at Gannett or Knight Ridder, which did do those things. I just know that at the Post, we did try some management training at one time or another, and it didn't work very well because it didn't have anything to do with journalism. And journalism is what we're doing all the time. It's all about the story, as I say in my title. And so you really want to look for reporters who are so good at their work and show signs of being able to direct that kind of work with others. It's interesting because when I first became an editor, I didn't want to be. I was an investigative reporter, and I was dragooned into becoming an editor, I think in part because the then local news editor thought that I was spending too much time in my investigations. He put me on the city desk. And what I learned on the city desk was that I was not a very good writer when I was an investigative reporter. I was a good digger, but not a great writer. And I learned a lot about writing from the people I worked with. I learned a lot about managing from the other editors that I worked with. So it's really best learned on the job. I guess it's more like an apprenticeship, say, in some of the trades, is to learn about managing and editing on the job.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious what role you think that style plays as an editor. And I ask because you and your predecessor, Ben Bradlee, were opposites in many ways in background, personality, and style. You even refer to yourself in the book as the anti-Bradlee. But still, you achieved a lot running the Post, as certainly Ben did. So what role should style play?
It's not an essential thing. And what I found was most important at the Post was the complementary nature of the executive editor and the managing editor. As you say, Ben had a lot of style and flair and a big public personality. His first managing editor, not his first, but the managing editor before me, Howard Simons, was more like me, and lower key, but complimented Ben in many ways. And I complimented Ben in many ways. He was not interested in the details of the newsroom. And that's how I became a more hands-on editor. I was already a hands-on editor, and I was under Ben, and continued to be when I succeeded him. And so therefore I look for managing editors under me, as a succession of them: Bob Kaiser, Steve Coll, and Phil Bennett, all outstanding journalists who were better at things like long-form journalism, narrative journalism, things that I was weaker at. And so it's the complementary nature of it. So I don't think it's important whether or not the executive editor is particularly one style or another, as long as he or she has people working with them who complement their styles.
One of the recurring issues that you faced as an editor was how to report on the private lives of politicians. And in the book, you describe what you did in at least two different cases. One involving Gary Hart during the 1984 presidential campaign, when he was suspected of carrying on an affair, and the other involving Bob Dole during the 1996 presidential race, when you were executive editor. And of course, in the Gary Hart case, the Post reported that one vigorously and published. But in the Bob Dole case, you chose not to publish a story about Dole's previous affair. Can you talk about how you handle those two differently, and sort of basically what rule an editor should follow, and whether to how far to go in exposing the private lives of politicians?
In the case of Gary Hart, Ben was the executive editor then. I was working with him on that, but Ben had the final say about what to do. We were not alone on that. The Miami Herald actually wrote the first story about Gary Hart apparently visiting a woman's home in Washington overnight. The problem there was one of credibility. We broke the story earlier than that about the fact that he had changed his last name and lied about it, said that his family wanted to change their last name, whereas in fact they said he wanted to change it because he wanted to be a politician. His born name was Gary Hart Pence, not Gary Hart, and he lied about his age in many different documents. And that was caught. Both those things were caught by George Lardner, a great Post reporter at that time. And so there was that background of credibility, I think, that led the media to be more interested in whether or not he was telling the truth about his personal life with other women. And then what actually happened there was, while there have been some stories about it, the key story was one that we were not sure we had down pat until it was recognized that we got a tip about another woman in Washington that he was seeing regularly. And it turned out that she was somebody who was well known to some members of our staff, including Ben Bradlee. So Ben himself called her, and she acknowledged the affair, but did not want her name used. And so we then continued to report that out with Hart's people, we never, Ben nor I nor anyone else, ever said that we would not run the story if he left the race, but he decided to leave the race in anticipation that story would run. So that's what happened there. He blamed the media, and then he decided to, in that same campaign, he tried to run again later on, and got very few votes in the primaries and dropped out. With Bob Dole, we discovered many members of the media, many media organizations were tipped late in that campaign against Bill Clinton. And if you recall, there had already been the Jennifer Flowers issue with Bill Clinton's campaign. So everybody was holding their breath as to whether or not his relationships with women might become an issue in the campaign, whether Dole would make it an issue.
And so somebody, probably on the Democratic side, tipped a number of news organizations that 28 years earlier, when Bob Dole's first marriage was coming to an end, he had had a relationship with a Washington lobbyist, a woman Washington lobbyist. And of course, I asked Bob Woodward to check that out, who better? And he was able to confirm that with that woman. Again, she did not want her name used, but she confirmed it. He was able to also confirm it with a number of people that knew about it at the time. And it turned out it was a rather public relationship. They went out to dinner, they went to parties. It was no secret. And at the time, he was living in the basement of his house during the end of his first marriage. And so the question was, do we run that story or not? And as always, I have to make the final decisions. As I think I say somewhere in the book, the executive editor of the newspaper is one of the last dictators in the United States. And the buck has to stop somewhere. Somebody has to make the final decision about what does and does not go in the newspaper. And so I convened, as I often did, meetings of leading reporters and editors, probably 20 people in a room at one time, and to talk this over. And most everybody, including my managing editor, Bob Kaiser, my national editor, Karen DeYoung, said, absolutely, we should run the story, even though we were only a couple of weeks away from the election, because I had always said that everything about a president's character, a presidential candidate's character, was fair game, and then voters ought to know about it. Dave Broder, the great late Dave Broder, one of the best political correspondent in the country at the time, piped up and said, wait a minute, this is 28 years ago. Since then, he married Elizabeth Dole. There's been no problem with that marriage, certainly over the years. This late in the campaign, it would be one thing if we'd been doing our profile of him, which we did much earlier. And if in that profile we had included this information, that would be one thing. But to have a story that leads with that on the front page in the last 2 weeks of the campaign, he said, is there not a statute of limitations on this sort of thing for a political candidate? More debate. I thought about it. There were 20 people in the room. Two of us didn't think we should run the story. 18 said we should run the story. One of those two was me. We did not run the story.
Then others did, right? Eventually.
Well, Bob Kaiser, as often was the case when he disagreed with me, said, your grandchildren are going to regret that you made this decision. It's going to become so famous. And I said, well, let's wait and see. And what happened was that the National Enquirer did the same reporting. And at that time, they were pretty good, I guess, in their reporting because they matched the story and ran the story. And a couple other news organizations ran something small about the National Enquirer story, and that was it. No story in the New York Times, nothing on the networks, nothing in all the other papers around the country. So my grandchildren, I think, can rest easily.
Another of the hardest decisions, of course, a top editor has to make involves those stories that have national security implications, and the Post confronts more than its share of those kinds of situations. One you describe in detail was the decision to publish Dana Priest's expose about the black site prisons that the CIA was secretly running abroad during the Iraq War. Even President Bush leaned on you not to publish that story. But talk about why you did, and more generally, how you approach those kinds of decisions.
Right. Well, Dana Priest is a remarkable reporter who had done many stories about what was going on in the CIA's secret war against terrorism, a covert war that Bush signed into being shortly after 9/11, as Bob Woodward much later was able to report. She was able to write about the renditions that were taking place, the arrests of terrorist suspects in other countries, and they're being whisked off by airplanes, in some cases to CIA custody, in other cases to other countries where they were interrogated. As she was doing this reporting, this was not a leak by anybody. Nobody gave her the whole story. She was beginning to pick up piece by piece, as an excellent reporter from all her many different sources, that something was going on in the CIA that was bothering people who worked for the CIA. They were very concerned about this because it was an extra legal thing, having these secret prisons in these countries, particularly in Eastern Europe. They were in new democracies, Eastern European democracies, where if the public knew what was going
going on, it probably would bring the government down. And it was, and they were outside the American legal system, and there were allegations that prisoners were being tortured, or as they called it then, enhanced interrogation, not torture. And so she was picking up all of this and gradually piecing it together. And she was also able to piece together at the same time the fact that some of those countries, like Poland, for example, I can now use that name after all these years, was engaged in other kinds of cooperation, anti-terrorism cooperation, that didn't raise these issues. That didn't raise these legal or moral or international issues, such as the financial things. And so, as usual, early on, we went to the CIA with the information she was gathering. You have to do that to see if it's accurate and to see if the government wants to raise any questions about national security or about harm to human life. And so some of the information we picked up convinced me right away, without any requests, that we were not going to write about these other activities about the countries. And then, so the CIA brought us in for a meeting with the then head of the CIA and the then head of the director of national intelligence, the first director of national intelligence, who I think was actually behind the scenes arranging these meetings. And they stated their case. And their case amounted to, if we ran these stories, they would have to bring these prisoners from these CIA secret sites to Guantanamo Bay or prisons in the United States. It would make the CIA look bad. It would make the director of the CIA, Porter Goss, look bad in his agency and to the public. And it might cause other countries to wonder about whether the CIA could keep its secrets. And at the end of that, towards the end of that meeting, the director of national intelligence pointed out that if we did run the story, if we ran the names of those Eastern European countries in the story, we named them, that probably it would cut off all anti-terrorism cooperation. And that made an impression on me. Most of the other arguments did not make an impression on me. So we went back. I told them we were probably likely to do a story. We would inform them about when it was and what it would be. And then Don Graham got a call from the White House. The president wanted to see him. And he said, no, the president wants to see me, but he'll come along. And our publisher under Don, Bo Jones. And so we went to this early morning meeting at the White House where the president made essentially the same case that Porter Goss had made in some detail.
In all your time as an editor, that was the only time, right, that you got summoned to the White House where a president appealed to you not to run a story.
Yes, that's correct. I was part of various interviews that the Post conducted with other presidents, but that was the only time that was the case. Yeah,
so this was pretty heavy stuff. And
CIA directors had asked me not to run things before, but not the president of the United States.
So the Post ran the story. It turned out to be a sensation.
And I did not name the countries. I ran the story, but I did not name the countries. So I was criticized on the right for hurting national security by running the story, and I was criticized on the left for not naming the countries.
The question that often comes up in these cases is, well, what gives the editor of the Washington Post the right to make the final decision on something like this involving national security? To which you say,
yeah, it's not a right, it's a simple fact, which is to say, you don't put everything in the newspaper, you don't put everything on the website, you can't. And so somebody needs to make all kinds of decisions made by all kinds of editors about accuracy and fairness and relevance and so on. But in the end, if there's a tough decision to make, it has to be made by the executive editor. You can't turn to the White House or anybody else outside the paper to make those decisions under the First Amendment. It has to be made by the editor of the newspaper.
Of course, the Post coverage of the Iraq War during your time was among your greatest successes. I mean, in addition to Dana's coverage, the paper won lots of prizes for its reporting. But coverage to the run-up of the Iraq War was, you say in the book, your biggest mistake. Yes. Because you failed to pay enough attention to the administration's justifications for going to war. So why did that happen, and what did you learn from that experience?
It was clear almost immediately after 9/11 that Bush wanted to go to war, not only in Afghanistan, where that covert war began right away, but also eventually in Iraq. And but he wasn't saying that. He was not acknowledging that publicly. Or the vice president was going around making what turned out to be false allegations about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, about Iraq cooperating with somehow with 9/11, which didn't happen. And so my attention was focused on what they were saying and what the president wasn't saying about his decision making, and showing readers that in fact he was going to war no matter what he said. And also the preparations being made for war. What kind of war was this going to be? And was it going to be successful or not? And so we had very good reporting about all of that. We also had some stories there was not much dissent about the administration's rationale. Congress voted in favor of the war. The head of the CIA and the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State all agreed with this rationale. And even foreign intelligence agencies thought that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction because he bragged that he did. He lied about it. But there were some people in the American intelligence atmosphere and who were telling good reporters like Walter Pincus to the Washington Post, something's wrong here. They weren't able to present any documents or anything else, but something was wrong here. There were doubts. There were also doubts about some of the things that were said in speeches that our reporters did report on. And when Colin Powell made his congressional testimony, outlining the so-called weapons of mass destruction, we did run stories inside by experts who raised questions about what he had to say. However, I put very little of that coverage on the front page of the paper. I did not draw a lot of attention to it. And being such an activist editor, while I was busy with everything else, I did not go over to Walter Pincus and to the editors and the national staff and say, what's the hell going on here? What more should we know? What more should I know about this? How should I make decisions about this? And that was a big failing. We still, the country would have gone to war. There have been people that have written about this who sort of blame me for the country going to war because of my mistakes. But nevertheless, it was a serious mistake.
So what's the lesson? I mean, what advice do you have for editors next time we're getting ready to go to war?
Be skeptical. The New York Times was worse in its coverage than we were. They say they published some very, very wrong stories, which they acknowledged later, false stories about weapons of mass destruction. So clearly that editor also was not paying attention. But the thing, it's to pay attention to all aspects of what's going on. And that can be hard sometimes, but you need to do it.
One thing that was very important to you as a high-ranking editor was never to appear biased. And you famously even went so far as to stop voting after becoming managing editor. And some people thought that was a pretty extreme position to take. You quote Linda Greenhouse, for instance, criticizing you for it in her own memoir. Looking back, you still think it was an appropriate or really necessary stance, and are you now voting again?
Well, absolutely, it was necessary. It was necessary for me to not make up my mind about who ought to be president or what ought to be done about who ought to be mayor, what ought to be done about various issues and so on. I wanted to keep a completely open mind. It's naturally that way. My mother was a kind of doubting Thomas about the things that she didn't trust in life. She's very skeptical. And so I guess that skepticism came through to me too. I'm just not naturally a partisan or ideological person. I can see many sides to most stories. But as the final gatekeeper what went in the newspaper, I wanted to not vote. And I told readers that because I wanted them to understand that the final decision maker at the future, the final decision maker at the Post was not making up his mind about these things, was keeping a completely open mind about everything. Plus, I knew I was being watched. And so when the day of my retirement became final, my wife, Janice Downie, formerly Glick, Janice Downie went online, which you can do in the District of Columbia, and registered me to vote. No party. I'm not a Democrat or Republican. No party. Which I signed the next day. But also the next day, a local blog here in Washington said, Len Downie is registered to vote. So I knew people were watching me, and they still watch me today because they're concerned about whether or not I was telling the truth about being nonpartisan.
Mm-hmm. The title of your book, All About the Story, is actually intended as a kind of affirmation of this sort of lack of bias, right? That it should be all about the story and not about to tilt one way or the other.
Yes, absolutely. And I show a lot of instances of that, I think, where we were wrestling with very difficult stories and the reader can see that partisanship never played a role, ideology never played a role.
You had a lot of experience at the Post working with Bob Woodward. You mentioned him a few times already earlier. And of course, Bob is again in the news himself with his latest book, Rage, about Donald Trump. A recurring issue with Woodward is how he balances his book writing with his ongoing reporting for the Washington Post. You say in the book that you never found this to be an untenable conflict, but you also say, Bob, was not easy for you to manage sometimes. How so?
Right. Bob and I got along very well together. He did treat me like I was his boss, his executive editor, whether he believed that or not. And so even though he was often secretive while I was off working on his books, he would come to me if he discovered something that he thought ought to be reported on immediately rather than being saved for the book. And we did so. We did do that. Sometimes it was a story by him. Sometimes it was information we passed on to other reporters. We made sure that the ground rules that he had set with his sources when we told him this was only for the book and not for the newspaper, knew that they had to agree to the changing ground rules. We did do that. We also published in advance of every one of his books while I was executive editor, series of stories in the Post that covered all the most important things in his books, which was another agreement that he and I had. I would read through his books or have an editor under me would read through his books, read through the book and decide what we would excerpt from it. So our readers were never cheated. They always had first crack at what he had found out. And so I'm ultimately comfortable with that, even though at times things that he withheld from me caused me to have to lean on him a bit. The best example of that was when all those decades that went by when Mark Felt was not identified as Deep Throat, when nobody knew who Deep Throat was. And I'd made my own guesses and was wrong twice before I guessed right with Mark Felt, but I didn't know it because Woodward wouldn't tell me. Finally, his family tried to convince Woodward to identify Mark Felt as Deep Throat while he was still alive. But every time that Woodward talked to Felt, it was clear that his dementia was such that he couldn't make that decision himself. And Bob did not believe that his family should make it for him, that the confidential source relationship was with Mark Felt personally, and he should protect that. And that was important to all confidential source relationships that Washington Post journalists had. So as a result, the family went to Vanity Fair. Their lawyer wrote an article in Vanity Fair identifying him as Deep Throat. And I was at I was running an editor's retreat on the Eastern Shore of Maryland when this broke. And Woodward got on the phone and told me that this had broken. And he said, but that doesn't violate our agreement. Mark Felt still hasn't told me that we can identify him. And I said, Bob, just get in your office, wait for me, I'm coming. And I broke every speed. I'm just lucky I didn't either kill myself or be arrested if I drive from the Eastern Shore back into Washington. He called Bernstein, who came down from New York. Ben came down from his office up as vice president at large upstairs at the Washington Post. And I heard Bob out and I told him, look, this is, the family's done it. Ben agreed with me. The family's done it, you just have to write this. Preceding that though, was earlier on, some weeks before that, maybe even a few months before that. I'm trying to remember how this happened. Oh, I know. He had always been making speeches. He was very generous about making speeches without pay, I believe, at universities around the country. He was always asked about Deep Throat. And he would always say, I can't talk about Deep Throat until he dies. That's our agreement. And then later on, he was starting to say, well, he's very ill. Perhaps he'll die soon. And you'll know who it is then. And I called him into my office and I said, Bob, Deep Throat may die soon. We're not ready for this. I want to be prepared for this. I want this story and that story and that story the first day, first newspaper after he dies. And Bob was being mysterious with me, as he sometimes was. And I finally said, Bob, what's going on that I don't know? And he said, I've written a book about my relationship with Deep Throat called The Secret Man. And I wanted to have that book come out right after he dies. I said, Bob, that's fine. That book can come out whenever it wants. I want to read that book. I want everything in that book in the Washington Post that I want in the Washington Post the very day after he dies and online before that. And so he reluctantly agreed. I went to his house to have a very nice lunch. And he brought out the manuscript, and it turned out it was Mark Felt, and my last guess was right. And we proceeded with 2 days of very thorough coverage, including an excerpt from his book in the newspaper.
Well, with regard to his latest book, I mean, do you think he should have reported more in real time what he was learning from Trump about what Trump really thought about the virus?
Very hard to ask for me to answer that question because I don't know what his relationship is with the Post now. I know he still has a title of associate editor and apparently is paid some small amount for that title. But he does not have the relationship with the Post now that he had with me then. He frequently worked for the Post. On 9/11, he came in that day and stayed for days and weeks doing very good investigative reporting after 9/11, for example. He was still part of the newspaper. And I just don't know if he has that kind of, I doubt that he has that kind of relationship with the newspaper now. So I don't know if he told the current great executive editor, Marty Baron, about what the president was saying to him and when he would have told him if he did. So it's hard for me to decide that.
You know, as I said it in the intro, you wrote several books
Yeah.
when you were at the Post. I wrote a couple of books. I mean, the Post was pretty lenient about
in the corner, but you can't see the title from here.
Yeah, but so, I mean, in retrospect, do you think reporters should be allowed to write books given some of the tensions that can arise?
Absolutely. In fact, it was a great advantage for the Post during our early years of Ben Bradlee's and my competition with the New York Times, that the New York Times at that time did not allow its reporters to write books, and they lost some very good and famous journalists as a result of that. Whereas we felt that by allowing them to write books, not only kept them on our staffs, even if they had to take a leave of absence for the book, not only kept them in our house, but also enabled them to stretch their muscles, to do things that are harder to do in the newspaper. You know, a book takes deeper and longer reporting. It takes different kinds of writing and so on. So we felt that many of our reporters, David Mariners is a great example of this, who still works with the newspaper today, and over the years has written so many wonderful books, prize-winning books, and that dovetailed with the great work he was doing with the newspaper. So we benefited, he benefited, and most importantly, the American people benefited.
You know, I've got just a couple more questions for you, then we're going to turn to questions from those watching. So if you haven't out there written your questions in the Q&A column, please go ahead and do so. You know, towards the end of your book, you spend some time writing about the Post's transition to the digital age. And in hindsight, you say that you should have been more engaged in the paper's initial website operations. Why weren't you?
Well, it was Greek to me. I didn't understand the internet. Both Bob Kaiser and Steve Call made efforts. In fact, Bob's was relatively successful in convincing Don Graham to get involved on the internet with the precursor to today's internet. And so we were actually a pioneer. But at the same time, Don thought, and I agreed, that it needed to be a separate operation initially because people in the newsroom were not savvy. We were not digitally savvy. And in fact, many people in the newsroom saw the internet as a terrible competitor to the newspaper, not an extension of it, but a competitor, and would not have been very helpful in creating a great website. And in fact, when we hired Jim Brady to run the website in consultation with me, I interviewed him for that job. And he told me about how our reporters needed to do blogs on the internet at a time when that was not being done by journalists. It was only being done by bloggers, whoever they were out there in the country. And I couldn't understand what he was talking about. I mean, these people in pajamas out there, we wanted to put them on our website. And he was absolutely right. And there were a number of things that he did in the website, that they did in the website that were innovative, always using our journalism. They by and large, most of their journalism was our journalism reprinted on the website. I did in my later years there realize what an asset it was in coverage on that long count in 2000, for instance, the long election count. We used the web for constant updating of our stories. Our audience grew immensely on the internet, and I realized the value of it. And so journalistically, I got more and more involved with it. But I still didn't understand what it was doing to our circulation and to our economic base as well as I should have. And Don still was interested in the paper being primarily a local newspaper because that's where our advertising was. And even though he was a pioneer on the web, for which he gets relatively little credit, that was not one of his emphases. And so he came to the decision that the only way to change this was, and I had been advocating for a long time, that we should combine the two newsrooms once our newsroom became web savvy. And so he decided that the best way to do that was to start over and have a different publisher and a different editor to combine those newsrooms and turn the Post into a multimedia web organization.
It's an even more difficult time now, of course, for a lot of newspapers. I mean, particularly regional and local newspapers are disappearing. On the other hand, major papers like the New York Times and Washington Post are experiencing, a surge in reader interest, in large part because of the controversies involving Donald Trump. But what's your take on the future of newspapering in this country?
Well, first, I want to just say about the Post and the Times, it's not just that controversies over Trump drives audience. They've been doing other things, innovative things, in particular at the Washington Post. Jeff Bezos' personal ownership of the Post has meant big investment in a lot of digital aspects of the newspaper, digital aspects of the news organization, doing a lot of things on the web that both are increasing audience and very importantly, bringing in revenue. So the Post is now profitable. It's a private company. I don't know exactly how profitable, but they have said publicly that they are profitable now. And so it's not just Trump. It's a lot of other things that these two owners have done. And as are some other owners around the country, rich men who own newspapers in Boston and Minneapolis and Los Angeles are also doing innovative things on the web that are making those papers financially stronger than they would have been otherwise. However, that's the exception to the rule. And what is going on is what you say, are all around the country. Local newspapers are shrinking badly. And at the same time, there are new nonprofits starting up in many parts around the country to try to make up for for what the local newspapers can no longer do. It's important that Americans in those places support them because they are nonprofits, they're charities in effect, and like public radio stations, and they need public contributions. And their future is still in question. Although there also are now some national organizations that have been started up to try to help these news organizations, and that is in fact something I'm now getting very interested in, and that's going to be my next project once this book has been out a while.
All right, we've got a bunch of questions. I'm going to go first to one from Bob Kaiser.
Oh no.
Who, you and he started together at the Post, right? He was
we were interns.
and you were the kid from Ohio State, and
he was the kid from Yale. And our then city editor Steve Isaacs thought, okay, I can have some fun here. I want these two guys to compete to see who gets the most bylines at the end of the summer. And at the end of the summer, each of us had 13 bylines in the Washington Post, and we were both hired permanently. Yeah. So and we became friends after being competitors, despite the fact that we're extraordinarily different people.
So his question is, well, he asked two, but I'll take one of them here because you kind of addressed the other one. He says, what, if anything, can today's journalists do to respond to the charge that they are spreading fake news?
Well, first of all, as Marty Barron, my successor, has said, do the work. Continue to do the work and put it out there. Put factual news out there. So that people can see it and compare it to the real fake news that's going on in places like Fox News, for example. Secondly, they should support, as indeed the ownership of the Washington Post is now supporting, efforts by journalistic organizations to both protect journalists from harm and to advocate for the truth of fact-finding journalism. And third of all, there's a movement now in the country called news literacy. And there are two different organizations working on this, and their efforts are growing. They're trying to educate people in schools. They're trying to educate adults. One of them is going to have a national project starting right now to advocate voting and to tell people to pay attention to fact-finding news in their decisions about voting. And people should support that. That's what's going on now.
Got a question here from Joshua Paget. Mr. Downie, thank you for your iconic and inspirational work. As a huge fan of the rules of the game, Would you say your years of investigative journalism helped the writing process for your novel, or was it totally a different beast to tackle?
Right. As I said earlier, my writing when I was an investigative reporter was not very good. And a lot of editors had to help me shape my prose to get it into publication. But then I learned by editing and working with really talented journalists in the newsroom who were good writers, how to increasingly write better. And I was a foreign correspondent for a while in the early 1980s and worked on my writing a lot then. I had to write almost every day from London about things going on in Europe. So when it came time and again, continued obviously as executive editor to oversee the writing by really talented writers in the newsroom. So when it came to write a novel, I both was able to, they say, write what you know, which is what I did. I wrote about investigative reporting and politics and things in Washington. I was able to draw on my experience as a reporter and as an editor for a lot of the scenes in the book are scenes that took place in real life, but slightly changed for fictional purposes. And I was able to draw on the progress I made as a writer. I believe, though, that the current book is still the best thing I've ever written. I think I continue to get better. I'm 78 years old now, and I think I can continue to improve as a writer. The more you write, the more you can improve. And I have a lot of really smart people, including Mr. Kaiser, reading what I write and giving me advice on how to make it better.
Nick, not sure how you pronounce his last name. He asks, as a retired DC transplant living in Florida, I have a post-digital subscription, but I'm old school and love, in all caps, holding and reading a print newspaper, especially the Post. Are there any advantages of digital over print, if any, besides cost?
Immediacy. Because I read WashingtonPost.com all day long and other things on the web all day long. And I also read the printed newspaper, the Washington Post and the New York Times cover to cover every day, because I see things in those newspapers, in printed newspapers, that I don't find on the internet. It's probably there someplace, but the way the internet sites are organized, all internet sites are organized, you can't find everything that's in a big printed newspaper. And you don't have the experience of turning one page after another to be surprised by some things you find in the paper. But on the other hand, much of what I see in the newspapers, I've already read on the internet because it was available to me earlier than in the newspaper itself. So I read both, and I think that's great for everybody who has the opportunity to do so.
Now here's a question from someone named Bill Miller. I don't know if this is the Bill Miller who used to be at the Post, but in any case, he asks, in today's climate, how difficult is it for editors to have the time for a careful and studied discussion about whether to go with an explosive article? What would you advise?
That's a really good question. And I don't know what's currently going on at the Post in regard to that. I've now been gone for more than a decade. But I imagine that's really difficult, and particularly with the time constraints of the internet itself and how fast you have to get things up. The main thing is to obviously have, as I did, really talented, strong editors underneath you who can help make those decisions and to work with them in a way in which you come to trust their judgments and know that they will come to you. Ben had the no surprises rule that I had, and I assume Marty Barron has, in which I insisted that everybody in the newsroom, including reporters who might see anything that I should know about going to the next day's newspaper, that I should know about in advance, because it could be wrong or it could be changed or it should be played better or whatever, to come to me. There should be no surprises in the next day's newspaper to me that I would have wanted to know about in advance. And I assume that's still the case with senior editors at the Post. I know a number of the editors. I know Marty's very, very strong, and I know a number of the editors under him are really, really great editors. So I think as a group, they can make these decisions.
Do you know a David Downie who's watching, or is that?
Yes, I do. He's my eldest son.
All right. Well, David wants to know, he wants you to explain the separation of the news side of the Post and the editorial page during your time at the paper. Do you know if the division still exists? Does it exist at other influential newspapers?
Okay, a plug for my son. He's a professor at the Fairfield University in Connecticut and a good critic of me and my work.
Nice of him to use his real name and asking a question.
That's right. Right. I believe that separation should be absolute. I tell this little story in the book about when I was a college journalist. I was the editor of the editorial page at one point of the Ohio State newspaper, a daily newspaper, 5 days a week newspaper. And one night when I happened to be there working late on an editorial, a big news story broke. The president of the university he actually closed down a building to stop a speaker from appearing, a left-wing speaker from appearing, that a faculty member had invited, that the president decided should not speak at the university. And so I ran out and covered that story. And I ran back and I wrote that story as the lead of the newspaper. And then I changed desks. I moved over to my desk as the editor of the editorial page, and I wrote the lead editorial condemning the president for doing that. And afterwards, I realized that was wrong. And I remember from the very beginning of Ben's tenure at the Post, not only did he want the newspaper to be as straight and nonpartisan as possible, he wanted the complete separation. So his predecessor had been the editor of both the news gathering and the editorial page, the great Russ Wiggins. And Ben said no to Catherine Graham. I want to be the executive editor of the news gathering, the newsroom, and the editor of the editorial page should be separate from me and report separately to the publisher. And it's been that way ever since at the Post. It's that way at the New York Times, many other newspapers. Never did a member of the editorial page attend any of my news meetings or have anything to say about how our news coverage worked. Never did I attend a meeting of the editorial page meetings or have anything to say about their editorials. And I often at election time would write about the separation of what we called church and state at the Post to try to convince our readers that if the Post endorsed a candidate for president or mayor or something, that was not going to affect our news coverage, for example.
So this next question you addressed in part, but it's from a former colleague who we both enjoyed working with, Tom Wilkinson.
Yes.
Any thoughts on how the digital age and the accompanying pressure to publish quickly affects the reporting process, particularly how complete it can be for a particular story?
Right. It cuts both ways because sometimes rushing a story onto the internet makes it too incomplete, or sometimes there are mistakes. And you can take it down right away, but somebody out there already has a picture of it and is going to tell the world about this terrible mistake you made. So you have to be very careful about how fast you move and whether or not the story has been carefully edited before it goes on the web. On the other hand, by being able to post stories all day long, like for instance, if you're covering politics, you're covering the campaign, and you're writing about a campaign appearance that took place in the morning, and you're quoting people from that particular party about it and so on, you've then got people will read that from the opposite party, or some political scientists will read it and say, wait a minute, do you know about this? And then you can improve that story by adding to it or correcting it as a result of public participation. There's a whole philosophy now about the fact that we no longer should just be working within our own newsrooms, but in fact, we should be working with the public. David Farenthold, the Pulitzer Prize winning investigative reporter for the Washington Post, who's been investigating the Trump businesses now for some time, for several years, actually engages the public in his work. He puts up on the internet on what he's found out so far. He sometimes shows his notebooks with lists in his notebooks and asks people, what's missing here? Well, what can you fill in? Please contact me. And it means that he's getting more information from the public as a result of the exposure on the internet.
Chris Lee says he's curious to hear your thoughts about the critique that says the press too often engages in both sidesism. That is, reporters and editors have tended to quote people of varying perspectives and stories, but did too little to identify the truth for readers. The climate change story is an example of this. Why quote people doubting climate change when science shows it exists? What do you think about that?
That's a very good point. And I think the media's come a long way in a short time about that, particularly on climate change. I see very little from climate deniers anymore, unless they've done something, unless they've infiltrated the administration or they've changed some rule at the EPA or something like that. Then you have to report what they're doing and why they did it. But you can also point out the other side and quote authoritative people about why that was wrong. But I think there's less and less of this Me Tooism. I think political coverage is the last vestige of this. I think there's still too much of trying to equalize, particularly on television, the public appearances by candidates, and what one side is saying and the other side is saying. There is a lot of fact checking going on. There's fact checking in the newspaper. There's fact checking on television, particularly on CNN. That wonderful young man who talks even faster than I do and providing 2,000 fact checks on a single speech. But there's still too much of not making it clear to the audience that this is not just one side and just the other side equally. Back in the day, we were worse than that. I mean, in my early days as national editor of the Washington Post, we would actually measure the amount of coverage we gave each candidate in the primaries and then in the general election to make sure they were roughly equal. And that's ridiculous now in retrospect, because they aren't doing equal things, and there should be some perspective. Now, the problem there is veering into opinion, veering into advocacy. And you need to watch that. So that line is very fine between trying to get to the truth and appearing to be on one side or the other.
Susan Schmidt asks, do you believe the Post news side is nonpartisan now? Or do you think Republicans get a fair shake in Post coverage?
It's nice to hear from Susan after all these years. I did interview her for my book. Good to hear from her. As near as I can tell, I think it is. I mean, obviously, I used to always say one of our problems is not bias in the newsroom; it's bias among our readership. So people will see the same thing differently. I used to get letters from people that would castigate the Post for being partisan about something, but they read every word of the 50-inch story that they're criticizing. So that's good. They were informed, and I can hear their opinion. That's fine. As near as I can tell, I don't think so. But it's such a deeply divided time, and it's not just the newspaper, of course. It's the website. It's the various political blogs and other blogs, some which have voice. They're supposed to have voice because people like to get to know the person writing them. So again, I think that's a very fine line, a kind of dangerous slope where you can get into opinion and move away from facts. Also, having journalists, including from the Washington Post, New York Times, appear on television talk shows is also a dangerous, slippery slope, because even if they are not themselves expressing opinion, the other people in the pictures like the ones we have here surrounding them are expressing opinions. And how can the public separate the reporter's straight fact finding from the opinions being expressed all around him or her?
So Len, we have time for 2 or 3 more questions and pithy answers. So Jim Rupert asks, how do you feel papers like the New York Times and Washington Post are doing with their decisions to eliminate ombudsmen or public editors? We've now had several years to watch the results.
Right, I'll be pithy. I think they should still have them. I think they were very important. I often would have arguments with our ombudsman, but they were healthy arguments, and our readers could see from the ombudsman's expert opinion some of our faults and could see my responses to them and so on. But it was very, very, very helpful to me as executive editor to have an ombudsman, and I think they should still be there. I have to say that the media columnist Margaret Sullivan at the Washington Post pretty much serves that role now, and I really appreciate her work.
So let me combine these last two because they're both about journalism students today. And one is, how do you think today's journalism students are different than your peers? And second, what advice would you give to college students who wish a career in journalism, given the digital impacts of today?
Right. The ones I'm privileged to work with, who tend to be upperclassmen and master students, all master students now, are brilliant. I mean, they're really a lot smarter than I was, and they're involved in the internet age. If they don't already have all the multimedia skills, they're learning them in school. So they will come out being able to do anything in multimedia, anything digitally, which is a big advantage to them in getting jobs, because some of the jobs that are most important now in news media can't be filled by the older timers who don't have those skills or have a difficult time learning those skills. And so these young people are moving into those roles, and that's useful to them. The advice I would give to them is that, I say this all the time, is that they think it has to be a mission for them. If you really want to get into journalism today, it has to be your mission. It has to be your passion. It has to be your calling. It's an around the clock job. It's a very demanding job. It's gonna eat into your social life. In my case, it even ate into my family life, as my children would tell you. So it has to be something you really want to do badly.
So Len, that's it. That's it for us. I thank you very much for doing this. I think you made the right choice in listening to Woodward and going ahead and writing your memoir. Let me hold up the title here to remind everybody. It's called All About the Story. And if you don't have a copy yet, you can go into the chat column where we've posted the list and get one or several copies. To everyone watching, thanks again for tuning in. And from all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.
Thank you very much.